Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me thank to you all for coming here today, and I'm happy that so many of you could make it today. So, before we begin, let me introduce myself briefly. My name is Maula Arfawie, and I'm student of Islamic Education Department of UIN Maulana Malik Ibrahim Malang. So, as you can see on the screen, our topic today is talking about hadith from quality aspect. So I will begin by presenting the definition of hadith, then I will continue by explaining various kinds of hadith from quality aspect, and finally I will explain that the law in using this hadith. Okay, for your information, my presentation will take about 20 minutes and I will be handing out copies of the PowerPoint slides at the end of my talk. And also, there will be time for questions after my presentation. Have you ever thought that the hadith you know of have different qualities and different laws for using them? No, or today, many people simply use the hadith without knowing the quality of the hadith they use. In Islam, we certainly have two things that become our main guideline as guide for our life. One of which is the hadith. In discussing of hadith, it turns out that it's not just discussing its meaning. The hadith is the word, deeds, decrees, and approvals of the Prophet Muhammad SAW, which are used as the basis of Islamic law. However, behind that, there is another discussion that the hadith, when viewed from a quality perspective, has a different type and law in its use. In this part of my presentation, I would like to tell you about the definition hadith words. Hadith are all the words, deeds, and decrees of the Prophet Muhammad SAW as a way of life for Muslim after the Quran. However, it should be noted that basically the Prophet Muhammad SAW never ordered his companions to write down his word, deeds, or decrees. So it was only after the Prophet that everything that came from the Prophet began to be collected through a very strict process. During its development, it is also not uncommon to find false tradition or hadith which do not originate from the Prophet Muhammad SAW, but are said to appear to be from the Prophet. This leads directly to the next part of my talk, because its development and it is not uncommon to find false hadiths that do not originate from the Prophet Muhammad. The scholars who are expert in researching hadiths and have a good understanding of both their sanad and their matan group hadiths based on their quality. The classification of the hadith includes hadith sahih, hadith hasan, and hadith da'if. I think some of us already know about that terms. First, I will explain about hadith sahih. Hadith sahih is a hadith which is continuous or muttasil and narrated by narrator who is just and dabit, has a strong memory, and his matan are not shadh and illat or disabled. Similar definition were also expressed by Mahmud Tahan in Tafsir Mustalahil Hadis and Imam As-Suyuti. Thus, it can be said that a hadith can be called a valid hadith if it fulfills three conditions, namely sanad, matan, and narrator, who are just and have a strong memory. There were several terms that hadith can be sahih. That is, first, the sanad continues. Secondly, perawi is fair. Third, the perawi in the hadith is dabit in nature. Fourth, there is no shadh in it, and the last doesn't have ilat or defect in it. So, if some hadith full the terms, it can be said that hadith is hadith sahih. Okay, the second hadith is hadith hasan. One level below the quality of hadis sahih is this hadis hasan. In general, this hadis has the same three conditions as hadis sahih, namely sanad, matan, and narrator who are fair and have a strong memory. But there are the difference between hadis sahih and hadis hasan. That is in the memory of hadis hasan narrators who are not as strong as those of hadis sahih narrators. So between the hadis sahih and hadis hasan, there is a difference in the narrators of the hadith. In the hadis sahih, the narrators have a strong memory, but in the hadis hasan, the power of memory is low than hadis sahih. So there is several terms of hadis hasan. Are the first, the sanad must be connected. Second, the narrator in the hadith is fair. Third, the narrator has a David nature. Fourth, there are no shadz or irregularities in the hadith. And five, there is no ilat which can destroy. The last hadith from quality aspect is hadith do'if. Hadith do'if is a hadith can be said to be do'if. It doesn't meet the requirements as the hadith sahih or hadith hasan. This tradition, the hadith of da'if is cut off. The narrator doesn't have a strong memory and his matan has a ilat or disabled. Let's move on the next point. There is the law in using this hadith. For hadith sahih, the scholars, both from the ulama hadith, usul fiqh and fuqaha, stated that hadith sahih must be accepted and practiced. In addition, hadith sahih are evidence and arguments used to establish Sharia law. So there is no reason for any Muslim to leave it. The next is the law for using hadith hasan. It is same like the hadith sahih. The scholars from the ulama hadith, usul fiqh and fuqaha also agree that hadith hasan can be accepted and used as evidence and arguments for determining Sharia law, even though his status is under hadith sahih. And the last, for hadith da'if, for the law of the hadith da'if itself is various because the defects that are owned by this hadith da'if also different. Of the hadith da'if have the defects in their rawi or matan. The lowest position is maudu, hadis maudu, then hadis matruk, hadis makhluk, and the other hadis. And from the hadis where there are number of mysteries, in this case the lowest hadis is the hadis mu'allak, except for the authentic hadis narrated mu'allak by Al-Bukhari in his book. There is a Sahih Bukhari. Then hadis mu'dal, hadis munkoti, and the last is the hadis mursal. So that is a short explanation for me. Let me now come back to what I said earlier, that today many people only use hadith without knowing the quality of the hadith they use. So let me briefly summarize what I have said so far. That when viewed from a quality perspective, hadith is divided into three types, namely hadith sahih, hadith hasan, and hadith da'if. And as for the law in the use of this hadith is different too, because depending on the quality of the hadith itself. We as Muslims need to study deeply about the hadith, which is the second highest source after the Al-Quran, as a guide for our life. Well, this brings me to the end of my presentation. As a final point, I'd like to summarize the main points of my talk, that we as Muslims need to study deeply about the hadith, which is the second highest source after Al-Quran, as a guide for our life, especially hadith from quality aspect. From that we can know the quality of the hadith that we use, and also the law in the use of this hadith. Now I'll be happy to answer any question you might have. So maybe that's all that I can say to you all. I'm sorry for the recent mistake. More time. Thanks for your all for the attention. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.